And I mean both looking within, where is a sense of entitlement still lurking within me? And it takes a kind of a sense of insight where we're looking outward, right? What are the conditions in our world that prevent some people from flourishing? That makes sense, everybody? Okay? Yeah.
If he was so obviously wrong about this,
Slavery, yeah.
yes, what else is he wrong about? I'd like to see the list of he was wrong. And, okay, that's my first thing.
Yeah.
And
Okay, well, that could take us all through next week.
maybe this is my question for next week. And then, where's the delete button for some of this stuff?
Yeah.
And why is it even, okay, this is my thing about Paul, why is it even left there that educated people like you have to walk us through this to say, no, it doesn't really mean that. You know, why, okay, see where I'm
Okay, yeah.
with it?
I'm going to answer your questions backward.
Okay,
So
all
the
right.
most recent one, this is simply the problem with any ancient text. I mean, if we were not studying Paul, if we were looking at Sophocles, we would have the same issue. There would be positions that the playwright would take, there would be saying things that the playwright would say that would puzzle us, and we would have to somehow come to terms with it. And we were doing pretty much the same thing. So with the passage of time, and we've not only got distance of time, we've got linguistic differences as well. He's writing in Greek, we're thinking in English, we've got to make those linguistic gaps, or bridge those linguistic gaps. That's just part of the problem of interpretation. And it's unavoidable. I mean, it's hard enough to interpret, you know, what some politician is saying, right? Who lives in the same culture and speaks the same language that you and I do, but imagine if you were speaking in ancient Greek and living 2,000 years ago. So there's that. The delete button thing, I mean, it's interesting, it'd be nice to, and you know who tried it, interestingly, was Thomas Jefferson,
Oh, yes.
who had his own edition of the Bible in which he basically excised all of the Old Testament, except for one or two Psalms. I think he liked Psalm 23. And most of the New Testament, it ended up being a kind of a truncated version of Luke's Gospel, in which Jesus ended up looking like this kind of, you know, Virginia country gentleman who said cheerful things to people. I mean, seriously, you know, if you ever get a chance, read Jefferson's Bible. It's very short. A lot shorter than the stuff that I work with. But it's clear he just basically wanted to get rid of everything that he disagreed with. Of course, the problem with that is, Schweitzer is the one that also noted this about just the tendency of German scholars, is when you get rid of everything you find objectionable, what you end up looking, what the Bible turns into is a mirror in which you see your own reflection. Okay? So for somebody like, you know, Schweitzer, you know, who ended up saying, no, we've got to accept he was thinking more of Jesus in this case, but we've got to accept the strangeness of these folks, whether it's Jesus or Paul or Moses or anybody else, before we can profit in some respects from their insights. Okay? So there's got to be first a real willingness to say, man, this is strange, or this is even offensive, and then to deal with it in some fashion. Now, then, to your first sort of observation, what's the list of where he went wrong? Slavery. Clearly is one. He, at least on some issues where women were concerned, he's clearly wrong. You know, I mean, and he's even impatient with himself when he's trying to argue that whole thing about women wearing head coverings. And in the end, he sort of says, just do what I tell you, because this is the way we do things. And you watch him sort of try one argument after the other, and what he wants is men not to wear head coverings and women to wear head coverings, but in the end, it's not about his solution. For him, the ultimate issue is, how will we have an identifiable group of people who won't be confused with the pagan culture, where frankly women let their hair loose and men covered their hair in worship, or, you know, on the other hand, being confused with Jews. He wants he wants, in other words, a kind of an ethos that's going to be identifiably Christian. And of course, that's a task for every generation, and it's a task that every generation is going to have to answer in different ways, because the historical circumstances and the culture changes. What would have been appropriate, even when I was in college, it's sort of this is identifying, this is what a Catholic kid looks like. Probably, some 45, 50 years later, is not going to look the same way. I will tell you a funny story. I was at a local Catholic university, which I will not identify by name, but invited by one of the campus ministers to celebrate liturgy, and it's basically the chapel in the dorm, right? And it's a small room, not anywhere near the size of this room, maybe a third of the size of this room. And you got about as many people there, so it's all very, sort of cheek by jowl. And I've got this little altar in front of me, and, ready to start, and this girl comes in, and she's just come off the track. She'd been running. And so she had running shorts on, and she had a tank top on, and I don't really care what people wear. I really don't. But she dug in her backpack, and she pulls out a piece of lace, and she puts it on her head. Because somehow it was important for her to have the mantilla on, even though she was wearing shorts and a tank top and the rest of it. And I just thought to myself, different generation, different generation. I mean, I've been to plenty of those dorm masses as an undergraduate. I was not the kind of guy that came in a tank top and shorts, because even at 19 years old, the more clothes I wore, basically, the better I looked. And gentlemen, some of you are in that same boat. Just let me know, okay? It's probably a good idea for you to wear lots and lots and lots of layers. But that said, I try to refrain from judgment, even though I'm sort of laughing, rolling my eyes inwardly. But it's a different world. But still the question is, how do we understand ourselves? And then how do we identify ourselves?
Yes, but it makes me want to do that query of things like you just brought up. Because I remember when I was growing up in a Catholic church, this was, before Vatican II,
Sure.
and right at Vatican II. We always had to have a chapel veil on if you went into church, and this is going to make you guys laugh like crazy. But if you forgot your special little chapel veil, you would take a Kleenex and put it on your head with a bobby pin. And I mean, now that's just nuts.
Yeah.
And I just think to myself, how many other nutso things am I falling into line with instead of stepping out and just saying,
Yeah, I think that's why I entitled this series, Did Paul Really Mean That?
Yes.
Not that he say it, because we know what he says,
Yeah.
but what did he mean?
Yeah.
And whenever you're doing an active interpretation, you've got to look beyond what an individual says to what an individual means, including when we talk to one another. I mean, the active interpretation is inescapable. And the active interpretation always gets to the question of meaning. What do we mean when we say things, And what did Paul mean when he said certain things? It doesn't mean it's easy, but it also is necessary. Father Gary's going to make an observation.
No abstract question, actually. Do you happen to know, and I might have missed this, do you happen to know when the church first condemned slavery?
Oh, it was late. You have individual figures, Antonio de Montesinos, in the 1500s, coming to the island of Hispaniola, where the Dominican Republic and Haiti are now, and speaking out on behalf of, the natives there who were being enslaved, and speaking out in terms that sound strikingly modern. Are they not human? Have they not souls? Are they not entitled to their freedom? He was a Dominican, same group that sponsors the school where I work, and so he's a big hero for the Dominicans. And in conjunction with theologians in Salamanca, he was sort of the pastor in the field. He would write back, kind of these sermons that he was delivering in Hispaniola. The theologians in Salamanca, also belonging to the order of preachers, would kind of think through this sort of more systematically, and that's where you get the first articulation of what we call human rights, okay? So it's Salamanca in the 1600s where I see theologians talking about human rights and rejecting slavery as being sort of contrary to this notion of universal human rights. I would have to look up, there is a pope, and I want to say it's one of the Piuses, maybe like Pio IX or someone like that, Pius IX, who condemned slavery. But I would have to look that up for sure. I know for certain, though, that thanks to Montesinos here and the theologians in Salamanca in Spain, that the theological work was being done in the 1600s. Okay? But in terms of official church pronouncements, I'd have to look that up for you, and I'll look that up by the time we get together next week. Okay? Gary gives me homework.
Well, it is interesting to me to follow up on what Mary was saying, how in the history of the church there are some things that were not considered wrong that are now seriously wrong.
Yeah.
And I guess usury would be a
it's a classic
of something that was a serious sin that is not a sin anymore. And it makes me wonder why the church gets so frozen sometimes in this understanding of morality, when it's in our history that some things become not wrong change. And some things become wrong.
Yeah, Richard Bryan and Richard McCormick and Charlie Curran all together have done a lot of work talking about change in teaching. We've been reluctant in Roman Catholicism to admit that we change. We like to talk about evolution. We use John Henry Newman's language of development and so forth. But the reality is, these are euphemisms for change. And that means we abandon certain positions. And frankly, from just the kind of perspective of intellectual history, what that amounts to is what we refer to as paradigm shift. And I'm trying to think, he was a historian of science. Some of you guys may know, you've read his work. Thomas somebody or other, I forget his name now. But he wrote a history of science, and he's the guy that originated this term, paradigm shift. And it basically means you can make the old system work, but the math gets much more complicated, and so it's sometimes easier simply to come up with a new model that's much more, physicists will use the language of elegant, You get elegance that allows you to reach new conclusions and come to new insights with far less labor, okay? And what happens then, and usury is a kind of a classic example of that. Most ancient economic systems grew so slowly that you typically did become wealthy at somebody else's expense. Once, economies started to develop in such a way that wealth could actually be created, and oftentimes that has to do with the discovery of new resources somewhere, typically discovery of the new world, then all of a sudden, the acquisition of wealth doesn't mean somebody else gets exploited. The other phenomenon is not just the discovery of new resources, it's oftentimes the invention of new technologies, the steamship or something like that. These are wealth creators, then it means someone is getting wealthy, but not necessarily at somebody else's expense. At that point, you need mechanisms of trade and so forth, at which point the charging of interest becomes also a way in which wealth gets created without necessarily making it at somebody else's expense. So you get a paradigm shift, in other words. And I think similar things happen in moral theology. It'll be interesting to see, what I'm finding as a theologian in the church is that we're finding that what you and I would have called like ecological consciousness or care for creation, all of that, is becoming a much more important theological and moral question today than it was when I was growing up. And it's probably because we're much more aware, thanks to the science, about the fragility of the ecosystem and therefore our responsibility to not interfere with it in such a way that all of a sudden it begins to spiral down to a point of non-recovery, So I think the notion of paradigm shift can be really quite helpful in understanding why our moral teaching changes. But it does. It's as simple as that. And I think it's probably fair to say, and again, I'm not a moral theologian, I'm a scripture scholar by training, but now because I'm head of a Catholic theological institute, I've got to be aware of movements and other theological disciplines. I think probably where human sexuality is concerned, we're reassessing a number of traditionally held positions because, again, of the paradigm shift. We just understand sexuality differently than St. Paul did. His was an act-centered understanding. Today we understand sexuality as a really multi-faceted, multi-layered kind of phenomenon. It's a very complicated sort of thing. And it has to do with the way in which you view the world. It has to do with your affectional preferences. It has to do with even whether you're an introvert or extrovert. I mean, there's a number of different phenomena that influence the way in which one expresses one's sexual longings. And it's not just kind of what you do with your genitalia. It's much more complicated than that. All right. Anything else? That was the long answer.
Thank you.
But that's what I give.
Whisker.
I give a lot of long answers. Okay, so what are we going to talk about next week? Because that was your homework, to kind of give me an agenda for next week. Oh, look at them. They're all looking kind of guilty like this. Well,
You've probably already talked about the thorn in Paul's side.
oh, the thorn in the flesh?
Yes.
Yeah, thorn in the flesh. I can talk about it a little bit more.
Okay.
Okay? The thorn in the flesh. All right. What else? Do I detect from the somewhat embarrassed silence here that perhaps you are not as familiar with the Pauline literature as perhaps I would want you to be? Yeah, now I'm getting guilty smiles. All right, I'll think of a couple of other things. Gary?
How about his relationship with authority, like with Peter?
Yeah, he has a very complex relationship with authority. We can certainly address that. Okay.
I guess this is a broader question, but because we don't have that training, how should we go about in a sense reading and interpreting the letters?
The letters. Okay, we can deal with that too. Okay. Yeah.
And this is a broader question too, but on the other side of the ledger, I'd like to hear listed out what he did right.
Oh, we did a lot right.
And I want to hear.
Understood Jesus.
I want to hear that with your enthusiasm behind it. Yeah.
Yeah, at the school, at the institute, students say to me sometimes, young earnest Dominicans, it's like, we know you love Paul, but do you really love the Lord? I'm like, Paul taught me how to love the Lord. So, yeah. All right, we can do all those things. Anything else?
I don't know if it would be too much to tackle in one evening, but talking about other interpretations of Paul, specifically on grace and bringing in Luther and Protestantism and things like
That would be a big deal.
It would, but we probably don't have time.
Yeah, well, I can talk a little bit about that because there's been a real rapprochement in the last 25 or so years between Lutheran theologians and Catholic theologians, especially around what Paul has to say.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to study under a couple of those guys, which makes kind of like the second generation of people that have sort of sought to move beyond Reformation polemics.
Mm-hmm.
Are you Lutheran?
No.
Okay,
I grew up in a bi-denominational household.
Yeah. It's a very big deal, And again, in terms of the rank and file, have not always caught on to where the scholarship has moved.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, okay. Actually, we could probably do a little bit of that too. All right, great. Time to go.